Hi, I'm Em.
And my name is Bea.
And this is
Fangirls Anonymous. A quick warning, this podcast is not for kids.
We get into some pretty explicit stuff.
But if you're still with us and into that, welcome.
Hello, how's it going, Bea?
It is going great, Em. How about you?
I am good. Today we're doing the first of an epic series.
Hopefully.
Yeah, hopefully it turns out okay. We are doing the first episode of FicClub today, which is... It's just going to be epic, man. Everybody's going to read the fics that we recommend, and then they're going to send us so many questions and comments. We're not even going to fit all of them into an episode. We do have some questions, though, so we're excited to get into those. But
we are hoping that those of you who didn't read before we recorded this and sending questions still read the fic, partly because you're not going to get as much out of this episode if you don't read it. And partly because it's really good. So, don't be discouraged. Please go read this, support the author, give them kudos, send them love.
Yeah, this fic is just one of those, like, if you're into Stucky at all, or even if you're just into fic, it is required reading material, I would say. This is just one of those fics that you need to read if you're into this at all. If you're listening to this podcast and you haven't read War Children by Nonymos, please go read it right now. It's so good.
So let's talk about the fic. Let's just give a really, really brief elevator pitch summary about what this is.
Regarding that, let's now get into the fic in detail. Okay, so I have the summary right here. I could just read it out loud real quick.
Okay, and then I think I'll just go ahead and give broad spectrum spoilers after you do that, because we're going to talk about it. This is so chocked full of spoilers, like you should have read it by now.
Yeah. If you didn't stop before this and read it and then came back, go do that right now. Okay, good. So the summary of War Children that you'll just find if you look it up on AO3 is, after Bucky was released from the hospital, it only took him a couple of weeks to give up on himself. Difficult to believe in any kind of future when the simple act of staying alive was almost too big an effort. Out the frosted window across the street, there was a tiny homeless guy burrowing under an awning. Bea, go ahead and give us all of the fresh tea and the deets.
So this story is a modern AU no superpowers, in which Bucky Barnes, who in canon is the Winter Soldier, in this is a soldier returned from war who ends up living by himself in an apartment owned by his uncle. And he is got some very serious mental health issues going on, to the point where he really can't leave his apartment, and he's not in a good way. He's also very, very isolated. He has no real contact with any kind of a support network. And he ends up encountering Steve, who in this is Tiny Steve. He's pre-serum Steve, although we'll touch on that. And he is homeless and almost freezes to death until Bucky battles all of his anxieties and goes and saves him, and ends up kind of forming a relationship, and they end up living together in this apartment where Steve gets to have a home that's warm and safe, and he gets food and kind of bottom of your pyramid of needs kind of stuff, and Bucky gets somebody who helps him with some of his mental health issues. And the story is really about Steve and Bucky forming this relationship and Bucky's mental health. And Steve, and this is the important part about Steve, and the thing that is very, very not canon, he is trans in this. So he has to deal with both society's sort of reaction to him as a person, and of course his homelessness and his own sort of anxieties and mental health problems surrounding some of that, because he has not been treated super well. So the story doesn't really follow any canon timelines at all. Steve ends up, he's an artist in this. That's he would like to be an artist, I guess. He can't go to school because he's homeless right now and has no money. And so Bucky ends up helping him try and get into a very, very prestigious art school. And in
through a
return,
scholarship.
yes, and just does everything in his power to kind of help him and make his life better. Well, Steve, just sort of by being there and being supportive and being his friend and being sort of accommodating, ends up helping Bucky with his mental health issues. And here's the big spoiler, because you can probably get through about 3/4 of the story, and I haven't really spoiled anything yet. Turns out that Bucky's uncle, Alexander Pierce, a name you might recognize from canon, is trying to kind of use Bucky as part of a political platform to become president. And in so doing, he's decided the best option in order to both use him as a look, I've got a vet with mental health issues that I'm supporting, but also not actually having to deal with him, is to cut him off completely from his support network and isolate him like a lot in the hopes that maybe he will just remove himself from the equation, is what is heavily implied. And he is not a good person. He is a very abusive person. And so Steve ends up kind of figuring it out and laying it out and getting Bucky away from the situation so that then they can both start trying to heal. And you get some wonderful cameos kind of in the last third of the story with a whole bunch of other characters from canon. But to be completely honest, for the first 2/3 of the story, there are 5 named characters. There's Sam Wilson, who is just mentioned. There's Brock Rumlow, who is very much an antagonist. He is not a good person. He pops up in the story both to antagonize Bucky and to antagonize Steve. You have Alexander Pierce, whose name's dropped. There is a cameo that is from Marvel canon, but not from MCU canon. It's Kurt, who is an X-Man, and he ends up interacting with them and helping them a little bit in kind of a minor way. And then it's Steve and Bucky. That's it. Those are the only characters for the first 2/3 of the story.
Yeah, it's so isolated, like in a really good way, but
yeah, if you are at all intimidated by the just sheer scope of characters in the Marvel fandom, this is a great story for not getting confused. There is not a whole lot to keep track of here.
Yeah, and it's funny how it's so isolated in that way. The characters are also very isolated, obviously, but it's just funny because, like, you feel the isolation when you're reading it. Mm-hmm. Like, Bucky is so alone and, like, we're just in pain constantly. I guess we don't necessarily need to go into, like, the ending. We will later, but...
Yeah. That's the slightly elongated elevator pitch version of the story.
Yeah, that's the bigger summary, essentially. So, the reason why we started this Fic Club is so that we could have people ask questions, send in emails with comments and analysis and all that jazz. And we did get a couple, but we also wanted those kinds of questions to start off a conversation that Bea and I can have about this fic and kind of about, like, the fandom that it's in and, fan fiction itself. So that's just kind of how this episode's going to be. It's going to be more of a conversation and not necessarily a scripted, like, this is what this is kind of an episode, which is what we normally do. But this episode's going to be a little bit more relaxed. So anyway, I do want to talk. So we got one comment from somebody in our email, and let me just read it out loud because it's pretty awesome. This is what this person said. Okay, I read that fic in a day, and it's pretty hefty as fic go to power through on a Sunday, but it was so good. That kind of writing that just immerses you so deeply. I was Bucky, I was Steve in every chapter, and I share roughly 0 traits these fine men have in this fic. So, like, hot damn, a million hat tips to that author. What kind of research? What kind of editing? Just how was it so immersive? Amazing. Keep up the good work. Everyone else should read this fic. It's an 11 out of 10. I really adore that comment. Thank you to the person who sent that in. And it's true. We've already talked about how wonderful this fic is, but it truly is an 11 out of 10. You can't expect a fic that is better than this fic. Truly. Mm-hmm. I haven't found a better fic than this fic. Have you?
I think it's a matter of taste, but it is spectacularly well written. I reread it, and I only meant to kind of refresh my memory, and I immediately got sucked in. So
Yeah.
Like, as somebody who's read it multiple times, it gets you.
Yeah.
It reaches out and grabs you by the heartstrings every time. And
Yeah.
it is written, the pacing is so good because you really do feel like, oh, just one more chapter. And then you're like, well, I've read the whole thing now. I read the whole thing.
So I read this fic when I was probably 17. Yeah, I think I was around 17. And then I reread it, obviously, for this episode. And oh my god, like, the one thing I remembered specifically from that fic was A, incredibly well written, B, I adored the premise, and C, the one image that stuck in my head for like close to like 6 years was the image of Steve painting Bucky for the scholarship, or drawing him.
Mhm.
Yeah, drawing him.
It's really vivid.
It's extremely vivid, and it's so, all of the emotions are wrapped up in that, because
Mhm.
Bucky is dealing with like a incredibly intense agoraphobia. Like, he cannot leave his apartment. His apartment is his safety, and the only way that Steve is going to be able to get anywhere close to getting the scholarship, is if he has a live person to go and like draw from at this specific place outside of Bucky's apartment. And it's just, it truly hits you in the heart, man. It's so good.
Yeah, it's the image is so vivid because it is the emotional core of this story. The idea that
Yeah.
Steve absolutely trusts Bucky enough to go out on a limb and try this thing that he thought was impossible. He knows that because Bucky believes in him that he can do it. Like, he's going to put forth
Yeah.
absolutely everything. And on the other hand, Bucky trusts Steve so much that he's willing to do whatever he has to make it happen for him. He's like, look, Steve is
Yeah.
such a good, beautiful, bright thing in my life that I'm going to face all of my fears in order to try and make his life better. It's just, I feel like this story is one of the few stories that I would call a fast burn story that I really buy and enjoy. Because a lot of fast burn feels almost sort of hokey, like, oh, and they fell in love like it's a Disney fairy tale and they met twice. This one, I feel like it makes sense, but I also would argue that it's because this story is almost less about them falling in love and more about them falling in trust.
Yes.
Because so many themes of this story are about these two people trusting each other and learning that trust and earning it to kind of an
So true.
unshakable foundation.
Yeah, when you save somebody's life and then that somebody decides to like trust you, like, it's just, I'm sure it's just it just makes a connection, a bond that most people wouldn't have in that situation. It's just crazy. It's just crazy. But actually, speaking about the whole trust thing, and then also banking off of the scholarship thing, we did have a question from our email. I love the idea of a fic club. It's great. My question for War Children is, do you think Bucky was right to go behind Steve's back to apply to the scholarship for him, given the circumstances, or should he have asked first regardless? Thanks. I'm a big fan of the podcast. Thank you so much for sending in that question. Essentially, in the fic, Bucky finds a scholarship that he thinks that Steve is perfect for and applies for him. And it's kind of an ethical quandary, because should Bucky have done that for him? Like, otherwise, all of the stuff that happens after wouldn't have happened in the story. So it makes sense that it would happen in the story. But if you're thinking about it in an ethical situation, it's maybe not awesome. But you kind of, like, Bucky is just doing what he thinks is best for Steve, and you have to think of it in that way, I think, in order to feel okay about it. But also, is that okay to think that way? I don't know, man. It's rough. It's rough.
I gotta be honest, on a moral level, I probably can't condone it.
Yeah,
Like,
I wouldn't
it's
condone this.
probably not the right thing to have done. Having said that, on a practical level, if somebody offered to apply to scholarships in my name for me, no work needed on my part, or just did it, I'm like, I can't really be upset because scholarships are hard. Like, they're
Yeah.
emotionally taxing in a weird way.
No,
So,
they really, really are.
you know, it's totally morally reprehensible, but on a very, very practical level, provided you trust the person, You know what? Yes, please. That's an
Yeah,
incredibly romantic gesture in its own right.
it's true. It is actually incredibly romantic, but also, like, I'm happy with the way that Steve reacted in the actual fic because he was kind of unsettled, but it was more like, wow, you would do this for me kind of a thing. And I think that's actually what how people would react in this situation, especially if you are falling in love with the person, right? It's not like it's a random person off of the street that you've known for a little while, you know? I mean, it is kind of that, but um it's
It's a random person that you're living with now, so you gotta trust them
yes.
at least a base amount.
And Steve does, but it's a little bit more than just like your roommates now. They're falling in love with each other at this point. But let's just say that morally, ethically, it's not awesome. But if someone were to do that for me and I would have had the opportunity to get the scholarship after somebody applied for me, oh man, that is the sweetest thing. Especially if I trust that person. And I think that at that point, Steve was starting to really trust Bucky. And Bucky was starting to trust Steve. And also think of it this way, Steve has been incredibly helpful for Bucky's mental health and has been a really stable person. One of the only stable people in, actually, probably the only stable person in Bucky's life. Bucky is doing something that is not only helping Steve, but is also like having Steve go away. He feels like he's doing something really selfless. And I would say that he is doing something really selfless, even though it's not necessarily incredibly morally right. He is doing something that, in his perspective, he is putting Steve's future ahead of his own present. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that that's just so incredibly brave of that character. Makes me want to cry a little bit because he loves him, and it's so sweet.
Yeah, I might be jumping the gun a little bit,
Yeah,
because I know
yeah,
that we have another kind of broader question that we're going to address in a little bit, but
yeah,
I feel like that is maybe one of the core tenets of what makes Stucky really enjoyable is both of them at the end of the day are willing to kind of put it all on the line for the other. And that's so much the heart of the ship. It's each of them going out on a limb. I mean,
yeah,
the reason that not without you is such a big line in this ship is because it's how much more how much more love can a person possibly have than literally saying, look, I won't leave you behind in a
yeah,
burning building, I won't
yeah.
escape given the opportunity if it's without you. I mean, there's a fiery gaping chasm below you. There is literally you couldn't write these metaphors. It would be too ham-handed.
And then also, like, it all just circles back to the I'm with you till the end of the line, which happens when a soldier.
Mm-hmm.
I am with you till the end of the line. Like, that's just love. It doesn't have to be romantic love. It can be platonic. It can be, familial. It can be any kind of love. But that's love. And I think that Steve in this fic embodies that too, because everything that Bucky goes through in the fic, Steve is there when he can be.
Mm-hmm.
And Bucky goes through some bullshit. So, okay, when I was reading this fic, I just kept finding these wonderful quotes and I needed to write them down. And when I kind of sat back and looked at the quotes that I had found, I realized that it was all of these quotes are a really good indication. They're a really good example of the arc that Bucky went through as a character. He is dealing with just some of the worst PTSD, agoraphobia, and just mental anguish that somebody can go through. And this writer, Nonymos, so good. They were so good at writing out Bucky's anguish in a way that I feel most people are able to empathize with and sympathize with. Okay, so the first quote that I have is it's a good way to kind of synthesize some of the stuff that the story is about. So let me just read this real quick. Steve had always been awkward with showers and beds and touching and any sort of intimacy, and now Bucky knew why. He'd felt awful enough flipping through Steve's notebook without his permission, but this was nothing compared to the shame which had clawed at him all week over seeing Steve's ID. He shouldn't have seen this. He didn't know shit about gender, but he knew what it was to be outed, and he felt so abjectly guilty he'd been having stomach pains. The second he'd seen the picture of the name, he'd known he'd gone too far, known the entire attempt had been a horrible mistake. But by then, it was too late. Beyond even his guilt lay anticipated shame. He'd never met a trans person, or if he had, he hadn't been aware of it, and he'd been so scared he wouldn't be able to help looking at Steve differently, now that he knew. It was one of the many reasons he'd been hiding in his room like the pathetic idiot he was, leaving Steve all alone to face Rumlow and God knew what else. There was no fucking limit to how much Bucky despised himself over this whole mess, and he hated himself even more for this very feeling, because he didn't get to fuck up and then whine about fucking up. This wasn't how it worked. But as it turned out, now that he'd finally crawled out of his room, the complete opposite of what he'd feared was happening to him. He couldn't have looked at Steve differently, even if he tried. In fact, now that his obligatory moment of blind panic was over and done, he found that he literally didn't know what to do with this information. Steve was still Steve. He hadn't magically turned into a girl overnight. There wasn't anything different about him, about the way he talked, or whatever. So Bucky had accidentally found out some stuff about his genitals. Awkward, sure, but hardly earth-shattering, all things considered. If anything, the whole affair would only serve to shed a sad light on what kind of problems Steve's cousins might have had with him, and why Steve felt like he couldn't fit in the homeless shelters. But the fact remained that Bucky shouldn't have known this. He'd intruded on what little privacy Steve still had, and he felt so awful about it he wished someone could have wiped his mind. Oh boy, that last sentence literally murders me. It kills me every time I read it, because obviously it harkens back to the canon.
Mm-hmm.
But also it is like such a descriptive way to describe somebody who is like dealing with mental anguish. Like, I have dealt with mental anguish in my life, and this writer hits it on the note. Like, I can't. It's really hard for me to talk about it in a non-emotive way, but the author truly does get it right. What do you think about that quote, Bea?
The part of it that I definitely empathized with is the part where he's having this panic, where he's like, okay, not only did I definitely out this person who didn't intend to be outed, but like, how do you deal with this information? Because you're trying to not be a terrible person about it, but there's that initial awkwardness that you know is just making everything worse. I've definitely been that person who's like, oh geez, do I say something? Do I not say something? Like, what level of transparency is polite and courteous here? You know, because it is about trust and comfort and already having kind of the base knowledge in place for like how to act and what to do. And then having that sort of epiphany moment where you're like, oh wait, I need to stop being weird about it, because being weird about it is making it weird.
True. Yeah, I think, doesn't Steve also have a kind of not necessarily similar experience with Bucky, but like he also has to deal with like, I can't be weird about him not being able to do certain stuff in the apartment because then it's making it weird. Like he can't do his dishes and that kind of thing. And Bucky is over in the corner beating himself up because he can't do the dishes. Oh, it sucks.
It's actually really interesting because this fic has another really strong theme, in my opinion, about communication, where the characters are a lot of times very narratively rewarded when they do communicate. Like, the more effort that each of them put into communicating, the better their relationship is and the easier things are. And when they're not communicating, that's a lot of narrative tension. Like in the quote that you just did, the fact that he hadn't been talking to Steve had been creating a problem. There's, at one point, Steve is just absolutely cleaning the heck out of the apartment and thinks he's doing such a good job, but Bucky is really, really stressed out by it. So there's this huge narrative tension where Bucky is just agonizing over this cleaning, and Steve thinks he's doing a good thing, but because they don't communicate, there's a problem. But it's really interesting because some of the things that I guess most people would assume would be like, oh, those are important things they need to communicate about and be explicit about, they never do communicate. Like, they're by the time they have a conversation, everybody knows that everybody knows, or in the case of Steve being trans, it's the one conversation, and they go, oh, and move on with their lives. But it really is kind of funny because in the story Bucky is gay, which is not something that they ever really talk about or talk about at all. It's something that Steve picks up through these not so great comments from from Rumlow.
Ugh.
And they never talk about it again. Like, it's just taken as given, and it's like, huh, weird. They never did talk about that. Or yeah, the
Yeah.
fact that Bucky has agoraphobia is not ever something that he says to himself, really, and it's not something that Steve tells him or vice versa. It's something that Steve figures out and discusses with other characters, which, maybe that's just part of the really good writing. Is there's no hello Bob in this story, really. It's if
Mm-hmm.
things are being realized, it's internal, and if they are contextually necessary, then you talk about it out loud.
That's just natural. That's just how people talk. Nobody ever explicitly states things that that everybody in the room knows. You know, like like in theater or in a TV show or a movie, somebody just walks in and explains the situation to a group of people that already know everything and then was there. Like that wouldn't happen in real life. So it's just incredibly realistic.
The quintessential example that I can think of that people may or may not have seen is making fun of bad writing, and it's my character goes down the stairs. Hello, older brother, I say. Hello, younger sister, he says. Do you remember that one time when our mother burned to death 3 years ago and now our father is a raging alcoholic? And you're like, that's not a thing that people say.
That just isn't how things work. No, it's not realistic in the slightest, unless that they're making fun of something. Unless it's a parody.
Or I guess unless they're in Alien doing some kind of weird satire of, I
It's
don't know,
true.
sitcoms or something.
Let's just say that that's another checkbox into how wonderful this fic is. That's just another part of the realistic way that the fic is written. Okay, so on the choo choo train of Bucky's arc, here's another quote. He hadn't had a true anxiety attack since he'd left New York. Only this odd, everlasting stress, which sometimes clutched him tighter in its claws and sometimes almost released him. Going sane, Bucky found, felt about the same as going crazy. Shifting from one state to another. Great confusion either way. Transitioning. Maybe Steve could relate to some of those feelings if Bucky told him about it. This was progress, probably. None of this one step at a time bullshit, though. More like 2 steps forward, 3 steps backwards, just a jump to the left and then a step to the right. This was how James Buchanan Barnes was getting home from the war. An incredibly impactful quote, I would say. And I love that last sentence.
Yeah, there's actually, so it's interesting because usually sentences like that you get once in a fic if it's well
Yeah.
written. They don't harp on it. But I find that particular line, "This is how he came home from the war," really interesting because the author actually chose to use it twice. In
Yeah.
one scene, it's an earlier, this is the second instance. In an earlier scene, after sort of Pierce has been exposed for his abuse and Bucky has been taken out of
Mm-hmm.
that situation, and he's separated from Steve and doesn't know what has happened to him, and he's very stressed and traumatized, and it's not a good day, and he's just sort of like having a meltdown in the back of his sister's car, and he's just thinking about, like, he must seem pathetic, like a little kid who had to be picked up, and not like an extremely traumatized man who's been systemically abused for several months at least. And at the end of that scene, they have the line, "And this is how James Buchanan Barnes came home from the war." And it's almost, it feels, because it's from Bucky's point of view, very defeatist. Like,
Yeah.
look at me, I'm just a mess. I'm a wreck. I'm being driven home by somebody else, somebody I've been ignoring and haven't seen in months and have a rocky relationship with. And I'm going to my parents' house in, like, disgrace. And then you have this
Oh,
second instance where he's recovering. And this is how he comes home from the war. Just, in my mind, it really works because, in the one hand, it's sad, and in this one, it's almost hopeful. But it also, I think, harkens back to what he's talking about, the cyclical nature of recovery, where it is not linear. There is no one point where he is home from the war. This is always him coming back somehow. He's always moving forward.
yeah. When I was a teenager, I was dealing with mental health problems. And when I was 17, I was in the thick of it. So this fic was really important to me when I was 17, and reading it again just made me realize it was a good solid 6 or 7 years in between those two readings, and reading it again made me realize that I have worked really hard to come home from the war that was in my mind. I never went to a war, and I was never enlisted or anything like that, but life has become exponentially better for me since the first time I read this fic, and I kind of got a really good perspective on that because I read this fic when I was young, and now I have read it again, and it was like the first time I read it, it was like I realized that yes, I can come home from the war, and then the second time I realized I probably have. So just personally for me, this fic is pretty important. I promise not every fic club's going to be like this. But I really think that I sympathized with Bucky's plight a lot. And none of these quotes that I found were from Steve's perspective, which I felt bad for a while that wasn't the case. I wish I had found. I tried finding a quote that really impacted me the way that all of these quotes from Bucky's perspective have impacted me, but I just couldn't find one, and I wish I had been able to, but Bucky's perspective just like I understand Bucky. I don't understand. I don't have any experience being a trans person, but I have experience being somebody who's slightly agoraphobic and being somebody who dealt with, I know I keep using this phrase, but mental anguish for years, for a concerted amount of time, for a really long amount of time. I understand trying to get help. This next quote actually is so spot on. It changed the way I even thought about my mental health. Feeling awkward in recovery was normal, Sam told him on Skype. For some reason, Bucky handled it a lot better than phone calls, even though the anticipation of a call freaked him out the same. He could only deal with the shortcomings of his mind using that very same mind. Kind of like trying to put a broken arm in plaster, using only that very same arm. In other words, yes, it hurt, and it was fucking frustrating, and a lot of the time it felt like he was only making things worse. Yes, Bucky's brain was starting to function normally again, and as it surveyed itself, its first reaction was naturally, Christ, what a mess. Hence, shame and guilt and 1,000 little regrets every time he did or said something, like thorns in his side. There was no epiphany, no sudden surge of positivity, no waking up one day feeling cured. There were only bits and pieces of himself putting themselves back together, and sometimes a milestone. Ah, that's so true. I wonder if the author has dealt with something similar. Probably not as bad as Bucky, because Bucky's PTSD is crazy, but I don't know. The author has done such a good job at writing Bucky in a way that I totally connect to. And if the author ever listens to this, I want to say thank you so much, because reading this fic didn't make me feel so bad. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for writing this fic. It's an incredibly important piece of fiction, and I hope you get all of the accolades you deserve, because you truly deserve it, man. Anyway, Bea, what do you think?
I think that is one of the greatest strengths of this fic, is actually this Nonymous's amazing ability to break down in a really clear, comprehensive way an entire train of thought. Like,
Yeah, actually, I would say so.
tracking through what Bucky's thinking and how he gets from point A to point B and how he views the world, I found like it's really easy to empathize with him, and because it does feel so true to life, like, oh, of course that's the way it goes. Like, that's how it's natural that he reached this conclusion even if he's wrong. It really helped, like, I guess I feel like I empathize more with the problems he's facing, and then, extension past that to other real people who are facing these kinds of problems. Because suddenly, you are in his head and you do see how it all tracks and makes sense. So I don't. It's one of the great things about this fic is how much interior life there is to these characters, I guess, and how absolutely rock solid that is. Everything about them feels like they could be a real person that
Yeah.
you probably wouldn't meet on the street because they wouldn't be on the street, but um you know, whatever's going on in their head could really go on in somebody's head out there. And it makes you compassionate for that. I don't know. It makes me compassionate. I shouldn't make such broad statements about other people.
Well, then again, though, if you read this fic and you don't feel compassion for these characters, what are you doing? Why are you reading fic in the first place? Like, when you read anything, you're supposed to learn about different perspectives. I think I'll just read this last quote that is a really good, like, button to, uh, I found a good button to Bucky's story as a character. And, oh, the story could stop right there and then, with snapshots of Winifred and George Barnes getting to know Steve with only a bit of surprise. Evidently, they thought he'd be taller, and a lot of warmth. The screen could fade to black as they all sit together around the kitchen table. The credits could roll right after Sam brings up the subject of Bucky's disability pension going to Steve. The blush on Steve's pale cheeks would make for a good last shot, just like Bucky's distant staring as the conversation glides around him, shaking himself up only to counter Steve's feeble protests and squeeze his hand under the table. But life doesn't break off so neatly, and maybe that's just as well. Um, Life goes on, and things get better, probably. And it's okay not to know if it's going to get better. Ah, ah. It affects me emotionally, man. It's just really good. We had another question, the last question of this episode.
This is the one that I touched on a little bit earlier.
Yeah. Let me just read out real quick. What are your thoughts about how they adapted them, Steve and Bucky, to modern times? Does it work for you? Like, I feel like their personalities stay pretty close, but also you do lose some of what makes them each their specific characters when you take out things like their origin stories. Basically, how do authors make the characters they write themselves in an AU while still maintaining their core traits? I know that's a broad question, but I'm curious to know what you think about it. So basically, like, what's fan fiction is kind of the question, because a lot of what fan fiction is taking characters from pieces of media and putting them in a different situation. That's what fan fiction is. And how does an author do that and make it? How does the author make these characters still themselves in a different situation? That's why I will literally always say that fanfiction is the greatest character analysis of all time. Because if you are into a fandom or a character or a fic or any which way with fanfiction, if you're into it, then somehow authors and readers alike intrinsically know if a character is in character or not. And in my opinion, it's because most people who are into fic are generally really good empathizers. And people who are into story generally like stories because they get to empathize with characters to a certain degree. So if you're into fic, you're empathizing with characters, you're feeling what they feel and know how they feel, then you know how they're gonna feel in a different situation. The reason why you read a story is because you want to feel for a different person, and therefore you feel okay within yourself because you felt that way before. That's why stories work.
I agree with our questioner that there is something lost about their characters just because Captain America is a soldier and he has a whole host of propaganda baggage toting around with him, and his relationship with Bucky and their shared history is a part of their relationship. Things that aren't really there in this story. Steve is not a soldier, at least not a military soldier. You could argue that he is fighting his own kind of a war, and he's never been to an actual battlefield, which changes his outlook and his characterization. He's not patriotic to any particular extent. And he doesn't have the shared history with Bucky. But like I said earlier, the ship, the relationship, if not the romantic relationship, really does hinge, I feel like, on them meshing and, having this unshakable foundation of trust between the two of them. And although Bucky's trauma looks different than his canon counterpart, they both are being used and they're both suffering and they're both being pulled out by this person that they trust. So it could be argued that, you are losing something because you don't have the super soldier serum and he's not slinging around a shield or he hasn't got a metal arm or whatever it is. But you could also argue that the really important things, the core, the heart things that people care about and kind of keep putting into their stories over and over and over again are still there. They still go through things together.
The question kind of is do the things that happen to a character make that character who they are? Or is the character who they are? Which is kind of a hard question to answer.
Yeah.
Because it's the chicken or the egg kind of deal.
Yeah, it is. There's an excellent little bit in a Welcome to Night Vale episode in which the host Cecil describes this man, this vivid scene, and he's like, imagine this man. And then he says, take the man out of the story. Keep the man, but take him out of the story. And that's how it feels. Like, how does one remove a character from the very thing that made them the character? Well, you have to assume there's certain commonalities, I guess, traits and relationships and nuance that you can keep and still have it be the same kind of a character. I heard a great analogy about, of all things, podcast characters, where fan artists who have no visual reference for these characters, it's all audio, obviously it's a podcast, have sort of reinvented the wheel in that we've gone back to what they did on the Greek amphora, where it was Poseidon because he's holding a trident. And it's Zeus because he has a lightning bolt. It's Hera because she has X, Y, and Z. You know who they are because of X specific defining trait, and that's how you identify them. Sometimes it feels like fic is the same way. Yes, they're completely different stylistically, and, if you put them right next to each other, you probably wouldn't peg them as the same person. But you kept the few things that are like, yes, this is the person, Steve Rogers is, for whatever definition and particular set of rules he's following, morally upright, and he chooses to do the right thing and fights for it, and Bucky Barnes will follow him to hell and back, despite whatever problems he has. Like, those are the traits. Those are the core.
I will say that a lot of the traits that people utilize for these characters in AU are traits that existed in the characters at the very beginning of their stories in canon. So one of the first, literally in canon, in the films, the first thing you know about Steve is that he will defend a person's honor, but then he will fight for that person's honor and then never give up the fight. Even if it's something that you personally don't think he should have fought for in the first place or defended in the first place, that doesn't matter. He's going to continue to fight. He's just going to keep getting back up. And then the first thing you know about Bucky is that he will look for Steve in alleys to make sure Steve isn't getting beaten up. Which is, those are the first things you know about them as characters. And in good stories, in good films, and good books, and good TV shows, the first things you know about a character are incredibly important to those characters. It's the way that the authors are able to introduce the characters that is incredibly important. So with fic, in an alternate universe fic, the way to kind of skirt around the fact that no, they aren't bringing in, serums and super soldiers and wars and Bucky not having an arm.
And time travel.
Because he's falling out of a train. And time travel and all of the stuff that happens in the Marvel films. The way they're able to skirt around all of that is by getting to the core of who the character is and utilizing the information we know as an audience at the very beginning of the character's lifespan as a character, the character's arc. So that works well with this because Steve's a really interesting character at just the very beginning. Bucky is too, and there's a lot to work with. But they also don't particularly change all that much. Their inner core of who they are as people doesn't really change all that much throughout the rest of the films. So it's pretty easy just to write them in fic and not have to worry about, oh yeah, that's right, Steve becomes a mass murderer later on. That doesn't happen. Bucky does, but because he's getting mind controlled. I don't know. Obviously, everything about this is a kind of a gray area, but I think it's interesting that the way you talked about them is the same amount of information you get right immediately at the beginning of the story that they're introduced in the films.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
It's, I guess there's a lot of different ways of looking at it. It's a little bit of a ship of Theseus problem. Like, how many pieces can you remove without making it a whole new ship? But at the same time, I feel like on a very practical level, it's a little bit of a looks like a duck, walks like a duck problem. Like, if it looks like Captain America and walks like Captain America, it's probably Captain America no matter what other trappings you put on top or remove from it. And to a certain extent, as long as it is, again, got at least a couple of those recognizable core traits, I suppose it doesn't really matter. It's just a new interpretation depending on what you value in that character. Because, I mean, great thought. You know, maybe you have an AU where Steve does become a mass murderer. Maybe it's a serial killer AU where that's very different. But you have something of his core character still there, and it's an assessment you, the author, makes. Which pieces of him do you keep?
Yeah. I think it's interesting also how, like, I've mostly been a reader. I'm also a beta, so I edit a lot of fic. And I think it's really interesting how readers immediately pick up on whether a character is out of character or not. You can't get past it. You like
As a writer, it's really hard, in my opinion, because sometimes
yeah,
you're like, oh, I really want this plot line, and then you start trying to
I'm
figure out
sure.
how this character would do it, and you're like, well, I've come to the conclusion that they wouldn't.
Oh, that must suck. But as a reader and as an editor, you can like very very quickly zero in on whether a character is in character or not in fic, and I think that that's fascinating. That so quickly, like just down to the like minutia of the dialogue itself, like that character would not say that in that way, kind of a thing. I I don't know how our brains do it. We automatically know how a character would react in a completely different situation than the story that the character was originally in. It's fascinating to me. And that never happens in this fic. It never happens in More Children there that when you're reading it you think that's out of character. It never does. The best fic out there is always in character in my opinion.
No, it's actually kind of a fun little thought experiment to like have this Steve Rogers meet canon Captain America, because you totally know that they would get along in a weird way. Like, they would look at each other
Absolutely.
and think about, they would have a chit chat and then they'd be buddies. And the two Buckys would probably look at each other and not talk to each other and stay on opposite sides of the room and understand each other perfectly.
They're like two cats.
Exactly.
Thank you so much to the person who sent this question in. It was really interesting to talk about this because I've been wanting to talk about this for a little bit, for a little while now, just talking about how I really think that fan fiction is the greatest character analysis of all time. Millions of people reading the same, or reading and writing about the same characters, truly makes the core of a character seen and known. It's fascinating. I do kind of want to talk a little bit. We've talked a lot about Bucky because I personally have kind of a stake with this character. I really love his character and I love his story arc. But we should talk just a little bit more about Steve, I think. It's pretty awesome that he's trans. Right, me?
Yeah, in retrospect, it's one of those things that you go back and you sit on it for a minute and you go,
Yeah.
okay, this actually makes entirely too much sense. It like
How much sense does it make?
so let's take canon. All right, in canon, we have a small man who is mocked for being small and having other somewhat effeminate traits. And he is very angry at the world and is trying to right all of the wrongs he sees while living in kind of a hostile environment where he is looked down upon. And he goes through a magical transformation to become a bigger, stronger man who everybody likes a lot more because he's more traditionally masculine in every respect, and goes on to use this power to go and help other people and right wrongs that he like. It doesn't actually take a whole lot to just very gently nudge those into, yeah, he was trans the whole time, and they used magic comic book science transition, and he just
Mm.
became a like more he just transitioned. Like, I don't know, you don't even really have to color outside the lines on this one, guys.
No, it fits so well. And like after reading the fic, if you read other Stucky fic after, it's really hard not to think of him as just a trans guy. Like if he's a pre-serum Steve, it's hard. It's really like it's not bad. I it's fun. It's a fun headcanon to have, in my opinion, to just be like, yeah, Steve's trans. That's just who he is. And then if he gets the serum, like he's just a bigger guy. I
They
just love
used
it so
comic
much.
book magic to transition him, and then
Yeah,
we all collectively move on.
yeah, that's it. That's all you need to know. It's so good. It just works so well from canon. It's just one of those like brilliant plot points in a fic that it just makes sense. Makes perfect sense. So, I think we don't have any more questions or comments or anything. So I think that we are actually done. I felt like that
Mm-hmm.
was a wonderful conversation that we had about this fic because, if, from what you can tell from the summary, like it's pretty complex. There's a fuck ton of stuff. We didn't even get into all of it. Like there's abuse that talks a lot about, like Rumlow and Pierce being terrible. There's a lot of recovery, which we talked about with Bucky. Just communication, all of that stuff. There's so much stuff that happens in this fic that we could have talked about more in depth, but I don't know. It's a lot of really wonderful conversation about a whole host of things in the world, and it never feels preachy. It never feels too much. It never feels unrealistic in any way. It's just one of those lightning in a bottle fix that I don't know if we'll ever get again in the Stucky fandom. It's so good.
Yeah, and if this matters to people, because I know that sometimes when I reach for something that's been touted as, oh, it's really really good and it deals with heavy complex themes, I always go, but is it sad? And I'm looking at you, Twist and Shout. Um
So true. Oh my
and
god.
this one is actually really helpful.
Yeah.
I it grabs you, it tugs your heartstrings, but at no point do you feel like it's trying to drag you down. It's always hopeful. It's about trying and doing your best, and in not succeeding but not failing either, that weird in between space where you keep trying and it gets better.
Yeah, I actually kind of want to read the very end of the fic. It's incredibly sweet, and I think it's one of the best endings I've ever read in a fic. I know we keep talking about how wonderful it is, but it really is just that good. Let me read it out loud. They left the radio on in the kitchen. The late night news is just wrapping up. There are a lot of candidates lining up for the presidency, and Alexander Pierce isn't one of them. And a distant tune carries through the half open door, strewn notes Bucky knows from somewhere. Gimme Shelter by the Rolling Stones, he's almost sure, hums a few disjointed notes under his breath. And he's been going to the VA 3 times a week and Skyping with Dr. Smith a lot, and his medication sits next to Steve's hormones in the medicine cabinet in reduced doses now. And the background noise of his mind is still there, but it's gotten a lot less loud, a lot more manageable, and he can hear Steve breathe with that soft snuffling sound he makes when he's deeply asleep, and sometimes he feels overwhelmed with his own fucking luck when he thinks back upon everything, so dizzy about how utterly unpredictable life can be, and he now stares at the screen wondering how to explain it to people he doesn't know, how to tell them reality is infinitely richer and weirder than that gray despair would have you believe. In the end, he brushes strands of hair off his face, Steve tied it into a bun earlier and it's beginning to unravel. Balances the laptop a bit better on his knees and carefully types out the beginning of his answer. One day, I looked out the window, he writes, and there was this tiny homeless guy burrowing under an awning. Yeah, super hopeful is what the ending of this fic is. Anyway, I think that we are done talking about war children.
Mhm.
If you want to get involved in this fic club with us, the next one is Play It Again by Metisket. The link will be in the show notes under this episode. And that one's really good too. It's also pretty complex and sad, but we can't wait to talk about it.
Yep.
Anyway, I think we're done.
Yeah. So I guess we'll see y'all next week on
Fangirls Anonymous. Bye!